Good afternoon. I am Caryn West, but I'm not who you think I am, and I'm more than happy to be your friend. It's just so I'm the director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre for Nursing and Midwifery, Education and Research Capacity Building at James Cook University. What I'd like to share with you today is a fully funded program that we've designed. It's a 3-day program called Resilient Communities in Disaster, and it's been conducted across the north, so the 4 JCU nursing sites and 3 Indigenous communities in the Cape. And I'm more than happy to come to Mount Isa if you would like as well. So, just before we start, I would of course like to acknowledge the Calcadoon people and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And could we also just take a minute to think about the people in Greece in the last 24 hours. Sweden is currently on fire as well, and there has been a major disaster in Laos with their dam collapsed. And it's a lot of people have died in the last 24 hours. So, why did we write this program? In Queensland, and in particular North Queensland and remote Queensland, we are absolutely no strangers to disasters. And when people think about disasters, we think of the typical things. We think of fires and cyclones and yada, yada, yada. And I think you guys get forgotten a little bit, especially when a cyclone comes through. And we forget that it's lovely and flat, this land, and it just keeps barreling in, and you normally get the floods and associated effects with that. So most of my team is based in Cairns, and that's just a little picture of the cyclones that have crossed the coast in Cairns. And we're I don't know if we're proud, but we're lucky enough to have been the host to Australia's most costliest tropical cyclone, which was Yazi, who crossed the coast in 2011. And we have the unprecedented honour of having to evacuate both of our hospitals. So that was the first time in Australia that was done. Different story, happy to talk about that. Okay, so what makes disaster everyone's business? Is anyone in the room a disaster person? Does anyone work for rural and remote disaster? Has anyone responded to a disaster? Yeah? Who's a nurse? All right, you're all expected to respond, and we'll get to that. Okay, so big shout out to everybody in the Australian and the National Disaster Response Group. They do a wonderful job. This program isn't for them. Okay, it is not at all meant to change the way Australia's disaster system runs. It is aimed to complement the way the current system runs. So very recently we had the introduction of a thing called the Sendai Framework. So the Sendai Framework came out of Japan, and it replaced the Hyogo framework for disaster response for the world. And what world leaders did was get together and say, what do we have to do here? What happens when things go very wrong? And for the first time ever, the Sendai framework turned stuff on its head and said, well, you know what? Everybody's got a role to play here. Because what we did was what we typically do and say, let's take everything away from the common person and we'll do it. They'll just do what we tell them to do. That doesn't work most of the time, because people sit back and go, well, okay, you want to be in charge? Knock your socks off. You can do it. So the Sendai framework brought it back to the people and said, we all have a responsibility, and if we're going to create a resilient world, then we all have a part to play within that resilience. So that's what that was about. So why change what's already working? Well, we talked a little bit about who's expected to respond. There was quite a large study that came out of Australia in the mid-2000s, and what they found was 80% of nurses that responded and midwives that responded to disaster situations had absolutely no training. They didn't know how the Australian system worked, how the world system worked, and particularly in places like the Pacific Island nations, something terrible happens and people turn up. By human nature, that's what we do. That actually creates more problems than you could imagine, because we have to try and organise relief when it goes in. And what often happens too is something terrible happens, everybody goes, and then after 2 or 3 weeks, when it's not number 1 on the news headlines, everyone leaves. except the people that are there. And they get to live out this story and this process, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So we sort of looked at this and we thought, okay, we've got to change this. We have to actually give nurses and midwives some skills. And the best way to do it is to implement something into nursing midwifery education programs. So that's what we've done. And in reality, it's a very, very simple idea that we put together, and the whole world's gone, oh wow, how'd you come up with that? Now, these things existed. All we did was put them together and said, how about we do it this way? And that's often, you know, the solution to a lot of things. You know, what we did was we looked at the trees, and we didn't just look at the whole of the forest or the whole of the woods. Okay, so adding value to our health students. The 3-day Resilient Communities in Disaster course originated from the WHOCC. It was a collaboration between us, public health, nursing and midwifery, and we went to see Red Cross Australia because they're one of the biggest response organisations, and we said, hey, what do you think about this? They said, love it. How can we work together? So that's how we've gone forward with this, and we thought, let's look at undergraduate nursing students because, well, hell, we've got them. But there's no reason why this can't be done with dentistry students and medical students. And what it does is it capacity builds an entire underutilised workforce. So these are some of the things that we know that happen. We categorically know after a disaster that antidepressant and antipsychotropic use goes up. And normally for a good 12 to 18 months. So we've got the PBS data, we've had a look at that, and we've gone, wow, that really goes up. We know that there is acute stress syndrome in quite a large percentage of the population because of property damage, because of job loss, because of major infrastructure loss. We know that there's a significant lack of preparation around psychological distress and how that's going to have a knock-on effect. People don't tend to think. What they do is tend to physically prepare for a disaster event. And we know that some of these acute stress syndromes and the, I suppose the effects of them have lasted, you know, for a good 12 to 18 months. And in a very small percentage of the population, they have post-traumatic stress syndrome. Okay, so this is it in a lovely graph. So you've got your warning system. You know, we sit there, we listen to the radio. Often we know when a disaster is going to come. Here, if you've got bushfires coming, it's on the radio. You can see them on the horizon. So as it builds up closer, stress levels rise, and you're sitting waiting for this event to happen. You then have a very heroic response in most people, and it's due to adrenaline. So I was watching a thing about the Grantham disaster, I think last night or the night before, on the television, and people, you know, somehow in a raging torrent got from point A to point B. They were pulling people out of cars, and they said, I don't know how I did it, but that's a real heroic response. And then you have a little honeymoon period where everyone goes, well, we survived, or most of us survived. And it's a very, very short window of we're bulletproof. And that's normally the start of the collapse. And there's a very intense drop, and certain events can trigger responses. I know around Cardwell and Tully, the wind, if the wind picks up, children panic, you know, and children have to leave school because what if this happens again? And then we start to rebuild, but this is well past a year, generally speaking. Okay, we know that the threats and the experience of people are different, and it's normally based on things like how the disaster worked for them, what their losses were, what their shocks were, how they were rescued if not. And there's a whole section here on survivor guilt. You know, why didn't my house go? How come I'm okay? I didn't lose my crop. You have small children having conversations like, I can't come to your birthday party because we lost our entire cane crop and we won't be out of debt in my lifetime. They're conversations I've heard 8-year-olds have. You know, so the greater the trauma exposure, generally the more severe the response is to it. So what we know about resilient communities is that band-aids aren't enough. We can't just walk up and run in and go, you'll be okay, here's X, Y and Z, and then leave. We have to prepare for them, we have to prepare people, and we have to hang around for a good 12 months. But it's the people within that community that can actually create the fix. What communities find offensive is when people from the outside swan in and go, hey, I'm here to help. You know, so this is about building resilience and strength within a community rather than relying on the outside. And what that then will do is allow communities to heal at their own pace and allow communities to support each other at their own pace. So it kind of goes back to that, are you okay? How you doing? You know, are you really okay? That was pretty devastated. And because you've all lived through it, you all understand the reality of what you're thinking, feeling and talking about. So this is what we've put together, you know, on the basis of knowledge, well-being and connection. So they're the tenements that we're aiming for. We feed into those to increase the resilience of a community. So knowledge of local hazards. What is this for you? It's no good me talking about cyclones to you guys here because the chances are it's not going to happen, but we can talk about things like mining and you know, collapse of structures and bushfires and so on and so forth. When we're down south, we talk about drought, we talk about fires, we talk about snow, we talk about heat. And of course, along the coastline, we talk about cyclones. So well-being we're using as the basis of resilience, and of course, a connection. So we're connecting communities through knowledge. So the course that we offer at the moment has a full day about resilient communities and really disasters. This is how it works in Australia. What we found was when Tropical Cyclone Larry came through, the army came. Colonel Cosgrove rode in on his horse down the main street. And in Yazi, they didn't come. So what, you didn't care enough to send them? They didn't come because it wasn't triggered on a national level. It wasn't that nobody cared, but if you understand how the system flows, and when I've explained that to people, they go, oh, okay, well, we don't quite hate the southeast corner as much as we thought we did earlier. You know? We have a psychological first aid day where we actually start to try and prepare people, you know, to how they may feel, how they can act, how people are going to respond to this. And you'd be surprised at how well that knowledge goes down and is accepted by people. And then we do a disaster first aid. So I've got to zip along. So when these are some of the outcomes from day one. So we look at ways to build resilience, and so it's a very interactive type session that's there. We use the moulage kit and we use disaster scenarios. So one of the scenarios is the roof starting to lift and you've got a 70-year-old male who's trying to chuck a Besser blick on the roof, and you all go, that wouldn't happen. Well, of course it does. The iron's flicked up, cut his arm, he takes aspirin daily or fish oil and he's bleeding all over the shop. So we actually create these wounds and these scenarios and we make people fix it with what they've got. So they walk away with a first aid certificate, but not with a hospital full of stuff, because we want them to be able to fix this stuff at home. And of course, the most effective response for psychological, damage and the aftermath of disasters is around psychological first aid. I think with this, the most important premise of it is, this is about preparation. This is about leading up, this is about making a change, this is about capacity building within a community before this stuff happens. And it's trying to reconnect community members and community people again. And that's a very speedy version of what we do. Thanks.